Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I'm the sports editor of the Herald Democrat, Jason De La Rosa, and you're listening to the latest edition of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. We have 1 week of high school football in the books. We had some interesting results. We had some perhaps expected results, but we have football, and it is back, and that is what matters the most. So as we get ready to look ahead to week 2, for those who are new to listening to this wonderful podcast that comes out every week, as we run down the games for week 2, we will look back at how the teams that we are talking about, how they did the week before. I will give you my thoughts and impressions and what that may mean going forward as we start to get into to the thick of the season now that we have games underway. Slight response because of COVID-19, unfortunately, is still around. It has not affected any of our teams yet. We got through a full week where it did not change any of the opponents or force any cancellations of games. Hopefully we can stay on that track as long as possible. But however, there may be a chance by the time that this podcast gets posted, somebody's game has changed. Either they're not playing or they are playing a different opponent. So I apologize in advance. These announcements are coming on a daily basis around the state. People are having their school districts either shut down to avoid a continued spread, or people are having opponents cancel on them, and then they find another canceled opponent to play, and that literally is on a daily basis. So unfortunately, I cannot control if there is a change. So just as a heads up, you may listen to it and understand that I may be talking about a game that does not exist anymore. So with that being said, we again have a full slate of games this week in week 2, and we will work our way down from the biggest to the smallest. That's the way we do it. When we get into district play, we work our way down that way as well. And the first game that we're going to talk about is Sherman making a trip out to Mount Pleasant. Somebody's going to get their first win, as Sherman is coming off a 37-13 loss against Denison in the Battle of the Axe, and Mount Pleasant is coming off a 19-14 loss against Wiley East. Now this is an interesting matchup for Sherman for a couple of reasons. Obviously, to see how they do bouncing back from the Battle of the Axe, but also because Wiley East is a district opponent. That is who Sherman opens district play against. And last year, Mount Pleasant won this game rather handily, and then turned around and beat Sherman 24-7. So Sherman played Mount Pleasant better than Wiley East did last year, and then when Sherman played Wiley East, that sort of played out because Sherman came away with the victory. People have been talking about Wiley East when we get to that game here in the middle of the season, that Wiley East has improved. Obviously, this is a case of that sort of early on because Mount Pleasant had some struggles to get anything going. They only finished with 157 yards. 110 of that was rushing, so there was not a lot in ways of the passing attack for the Tigers. And this was a game that they had a chance to win. They actually were up 14-13 at halftime, and then Wiley scored in the fourth quarter to get to 19 and take the lead. And so they were able to hang on as well. Sherman, like we said, is looking to bounce back from the Battle of the Axe in Corey Kane's debut as Sherman head coach. It was the way things unfortunately have gone for the Bearcats the last couple of years. A close first half, chances in the third quarter to make a move and put some pressure on Denison, get back in the game, and unfortunately they were unable to do that for the home side and the home fans, and Denison was able to pull away to win the rivalry matchup for the 9th straight year. A lot of unknowns, and we'll talk about this when we get to Denison too. Maybe a few less unknowns for Denison going into that game, but definitely with Sherman, a lot of new faces on offense, a lot of new faces on defense, and of course you have more or less a whole new coaching staff. And so you don't know what they're going to bring to the table, see how they're going to scheme and run things, and the decisions that get made during the course of a game, you never know until you get out there and see them play. But like I said, this was a game that was tied at 7 after the first quarter, and then Denison put up 3 touchdowns in the second quarter for a 27-7 lead. Sherman came out their first drive of the third quarter, and they got to within 27-13, so it's a 2-score game. They got a stop. They got the ball back. They had a chance to potentially go down and get within 1 score, but had some turnovers. They finished with 3 in the game, and they just were never able to put anything together after that. And like we said, Denison scored a field goal and a touchdown to put the game away there in the fourth quarter. So I think sort of a mixed bag if you're looking at it with Sherman. I thought the defense was better than many thought it was going to be. I know people will look at the final numbers and say, Denison had 512 yards, 332 of that was on the ground, but they gave up 37 points. They held Denison to 2 3-and-outs to start the third quarter. Denison got into the red zone, had to settle for a field goal in the fourth quarter. That really, it's not an easy kick, 32 yards, and it was the kicker's first field goal attempt of his career at the varsity level, and if he misses that, then it stays, a 2-score game, and Sherman's getting the ball back. So they were able to hold there. They did get a turnover. So I think there's something to build on there, and I think offensively, it was going to be a tough challenge right off the bat. You're going up against a defense that has 9 senior starters. A lot of those guys are 3-year starters, playing with a lot of confidence because they have had the upper hand in this rivalry, and you had a lot of new guys, whether it was Phoenix Grant at quarterback, taking over after being the backup last year. You had some new guys in the backfield, and unfortunately, I think maybe the way the game went, when you get down 27-7, going into halftime, you kind of had to change your approach a little bit. So that I don't think they ran the ball like they would have wanted to. Caleb Thompson had a touchdown run in the third quarter, and he had 7 carries. Kane Bowen, a freshman, he had 4 carries. And as a whole, Sherman ran 32 times, only had 94 yards. Phoenix Grant, the quarterback, led them actually with 52 yards on 11 carries. A lot of that was scrambles. Did have a couple of designed keepers that picked up some good yardage. And then, like I said, you talk about new faces. You look at these receivers. 6 different players caught a pass, and 4 of them had never caught a varsity pass before. So you had a lot of guys. You had 2 guys. You had 3 guys get carries that had never had varsity carries before, and you had 4 guys catch passes that had never caught varsity passes before. One of those was Vontrell Sanders. He had 2 catches. One of those was a touchdown. That's the one that tied the game in the first quarter. So I think you saw the flashes. I think you saw some of the athleticism, some of the matchups that Sherman would be able to win along the way. And they have time to figure that out. They have and when we talked about Denison. Denison it finishes their non-district schedule this week. Sherman has a month to work out these kinks. Figure some things out, what they like, what they saw from this game, sort of expand on that, and go from there. The bad thing is obviously you're going against a team that probably didn't think that they were going to lose their opener. Now they're looking at potentially dropping 0-2, and it's a pretty decent road trip. But it's going to be interesting to see what Sherman does this time out. I know Sherman fans are unhappy. Denison keeps winning the game. It's been almost a decade. If there is a silver lining, we have seen it. We saw it last year. We've seen it a couple times recently. What you do in that game does not define your season. I think that's the biggest takeaway that we're seeing now that it is the first game of the year, and it's been that way for 4 years now. Just because you lose that game, your season is not over. And Sherman has proven that by making the playoffs multiple times. Last year they tied for second in a really tough district. And I think, at worst, I think people are sort of projecting them to finish third behind Longview and Highland Park. And so you can't let that game define your season. And Sherman hasn't done that. So if there is a silver lining, they know that they have plenty of other things that they can do. One of those things is making the playoffs, which is obviously still on the agenda for them. And then flip side, we're talking about Denison. They're going to be hosting Fort Worth Brewer. Obviously, Denison is 1-0 after the win against Sherman. Brewers also 1-0. They won a tight game against Midlothian, 23-20. And this is a game that is interesting for a couple of reasons. We talked about the coaches last week. You had two new coaches on the sidelines for Sherman Denison. Brent Whitson took over at Denison, got the first win out of the way, got the first Axe win out of the way. And the coaching matchup this week is interesting because you have a former Denison assistant in Todd Peterman bringing his squad over from Fort Worth. This is a team that they've been pretty good making the playoffs. They have some big time talent, especially on defense. They have some Division I guys. The biggest one literally is probably Bear Alexander. He hasn't made a commitment yet, but his top 3 or 4 sort of Georgia, A&M. He's one of the top players in the country. I mean, he's like, if he's not a 5-star, he's as close to a 5-star player as you can be. As a defensive lineman. They've got some athletes, and this is a game that last year was supposed to be played because of the change with the staggered start and COVID and certain counties not allowing teams or school districts to hold extracurricular activities. This game had to be canceled, and Brewer ended up finding I think they ended up finding an opponent, but they had to cancel it because it was a couple weeks before they made the decision that Brewer would be able to play, and that's why Denison went to Texas High last year. So this year we're back to Brewer. So there is no comparison for last year, how they did, and we'll see that with a couple of games, not just this week, but throughout the season. Games that got canceled, teams that had to play other teams just to have spots on their schedule. So this is a fun little matchup just because we didn't see it last year, and I don't really know what you can expect on that. For Denison's side for the Battle of the Axe, obviously they won again, and that's the biggest thing for them as a takeaway. You had a lot of seniors starting on both sides of the ball. Like I mentioned, you had 9 seniors starting on offense. Oh, excuse me. 8 seniors starting on offense, and you had 9 seniors starting on defense. And so you had a lot of guys that did not want that to be their last Battle of the Axes. As the team that loses the Axe to Sherman and ends the streak, it's going to happen at some point. But you never want to be that group, and I think this was a group that felt that they could really maintain that for all 4 of their years. Jadarian Price had a big game, 22 carries for 259 yards. That's a career high for him, and he had a touchdown right before halftime. That really sort of turned the game. Like we mentioned, so it was 7-7. Each team had a touchdown pass. Denison went back in front, so it's 14-7, and then it stayed that way from early in the second quarter until almost right before halftime. Denison put together a drive and was about to go up 20-7, and then right before the half, they forced a punt. They got the ball back, and Price went 69 yards with 20 seconds left in the half. If he gets tackled anywhere along the way, there's probably a decent chance. Denison doesn't score or it's a field goal. It's a lot more manageable. That really broke things open, made it a 3-score game. The other guys who contributed, I mentioned Jack Allman. He had 7 carries for 79 yards and 2 touchdowns. Caleb Hebner, 13 of 17 passing for 180 yards and 2 touchdowns. One of those was to Trey Rhodes for 65 yards. The other was to Keegan Pruitt for 16 yards. And pretty balanced. Like we said, so they had 512 yards. 332 of that was on the ground, and 180 was in the air. They ran the ball 38 times. They threw it 17, and obviously you would expect that sort of ratio when you're talking about the entire second half. You're playing with a 3-score lead to try to continue to move the clock and not you don't really need to throw. If there was an issue, it was penalties. Denison had 16 of them. A lot of them early were sloppy false starts and procedure penalties, that sort of thing. And and then late it turned into some chippiness and some of the 15-yard variety. That's the biggest thing they have to clean up for sure going forward. And this is a good test. I think I mentioned last week, Denison's first 3 games have a chance to be probably their 3 toughest games in terms of, obviously, there's so much hype and everything surrounding the Battle of the Axe as your season opener, and that can be hard to deal with, especially when the game is at Sherman and it's on the road and they have a lot more people there because of the setup of the stadium. And then you have a Fort Worth Brewer team that is really excited, is really good. They have talent in all 3 of the classes, senior, junior, sophomore, and you didn't play them last year, so you don't have an idea of what your kids can do against their kids and vice versa. And then after the bye, then they're going to open district play against Lovejoy, who is currently ranked as the 3rd best team in the state. And there are a couple teams later in the district schedule. I think Frisco and Frisco Liberty. I think if we're doing sort of a mini preview, I think those are the 4 playoff teams in this district. I don't know the order yet, obviously. Injuries and that sort of thing will factor into it, but the COVID, unfortunately, may have a say like it did last year. But I think it's pretty safe to say that the 4 best teams, especially after looking at their performances the first week, are Denison, Lovejoy, Frisco, and Frisco Liberty in some sort of order, and we'll see how things play out. But so this first month, is really interesting, and it was one of those. I was talking to somebody and I said, Denison could easily start 3-0, because they have played Lovejoy tough the last 2 years. Losing a game last year at home that they literally had a chance to win at the end, and the game the year before that they go into overtime. Another winnable game. So they probably should say they've beaten Lovejoy the last 2 years. And Fort Worth Brewers is a team that I think is going to make some noise. By the time the playoffs roll around. So there was a chance. A couple weeks from now, we could say, Denison was 0-3 or Denison is 3-0, and either one of those or anything in between, I think you sort of could see. So they're definitely going to get tested. Each of these 3 games in the first month, with the bye mixed in there. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm interested to see how they progress from week 1 to week 2. I don't know if we necessarily saw a lot of the Denison offense and what it's going to look like with this new coaching staff. And I think a lot of that may come this week, because I think everybody talks about using non-district to see what you can do against other people, and I think. And in the scrimmage, they only had the 1 scrimmage, and they didn't really use their first team guys, especially not, you don't want to see J.D. Price get hurt in a scrimmage. You don't want to see your starting quarterback get hurt in a scrimmage by trying to do some stuff. And then, of course, with it being Sherman Denison right off the bat, that's not a game that you can really experiment with or run some things a lot of the time just to kind of get a look at it, because the game, every possession means so much. So this might be the week that we see some things a little bit different from last week, and then they can use that bye week to fine-tune things, getting ready for Lovejoy right out of the gate in district. So that's going to be interesting as well, as Denison hosts Fort Worth Brewer, and that is a 7 o'clock start. If I don't designate it, I'll remind people. 7:30 is the normal start on a Friday. If I tell you otherwise, then that means that's the deal. But Denison last week played at 7:30. That's going to be their only 7:30 game of the season. They'll play 7 o'clock the rest of the way. All their district games are at 7 o'clock, and all but the last game against Princeton's going to be on a Friday. So if you're going to a Denison game, whether it's home or away, from here on out, plan on 7 o'clock kickoff, so you don't get there like in the middle of the second quarter. The next game is going to be Van Alstyne hosting Bonham. Both of these teams come into this game at 1-0. Bonham won last week, 47-42 against Scurry Rosser, and Van Alstyne won 41-15 against Boyd. So Van Alstyne's game last week was a change. That was a COVID change last year. They ended up swapping out Gunner, who beat them pretty good last year, to a team in Boyd who is a 3A Division I team, so it's a class up from. It's a bigger school than what Gunner is, and they were coming off a really good year for them last year. So I was kind of interested to see how Van Alstyne would look in this one, and they jumped up pretty early, and were able to maintain that throughout. They had a 34-9 lead after 3 quarters, and then they were up 41-9 before Boyd got on the scoreboard again. So a really good showing for Van Alstyne. They held Boyd to a little under 220 yards. They didn't really get anything going on the ground. And Van Alstyne conversely was able to put some stuff together. They finished with almost 400 yards of offense. 254 of that was on the ground. Gavin Montgomery led the way. He had 10 carries for 75 yards and 2 touchdown runs. He also had a touchdown pass to Dakota Howard, who Howard returned a kickoff for a score, 76 yards. Sam Wyatt, he had 9 carries for 84 yards and a touchdown to pad the lead there in the fourth quarter. So a very good start for Van Alstyne. Like we said, for those people that listened last week or saw the preview in the paper, last year was a year they took the step back. They were 3-8. They're 3-7 in the regular season, then lost their first playoff game. So I think that they had a lot of young guys. A lot of these guys are back. Montgomery was a quarterback for the first time last year. He completes 13 of 18 passes in this one for 140 yards. A lot of guys were still kind of figuring some things out. We mentioned in the preview portion, I think last week, Jaden Mahan was a guy last year who missed the last half of the season with an injury. He had 16 carries for 54 yards, and just gives them another option, in the running attack, for sure. And so a really good start. And now they're playing a team that they have won 10 straight games against. They're very familiar with. They've played, they play them a lot. They've been in district with them for a while. And outside of some pockets of success, Bonham has kind of struggled. And they've really struggled in trying to stop Van Alstyne offensively. VA has scored at least 49 points against Bonham in 5 of the last 6 games. So if you're gonna beat Van Alstyne, if you're Bonham, you need to have it be a shootout, just based on your past performance. They did put up 47 against Scotty Rosser, so that's a promising sign for them. They have a senior quarterback, Mason Rodriguez, who's back. This was a game last year though where it was 54-24, so it wasn't really all that close last year. Bonham is coming off a 2-8 season. They won only one game the year before that, and then you throw in the season opener this year. So they've won 4 games in the last 21. So they're 4-17 in their last 21 games. I think that math off the top of my head is right. So you have a chance if you're Van Alstyne to get to 2-0. You only won 3 games last year. You put something together, getting ready for that small district slate. They're gonna have a really big non-district schedule because there's only 5 teams in that district, so they've got to play 6 non-district games, and they could get off to a 2-0 start, which would be really good to see after the season that they had last year. It does help when you don't have to play Gunner, and that leads into the next game where Gunner is going to be hosting Pottsboro. This is obviously one of the few games that we have that are all local teams, and obviously just on name recognition, it is a monster game this week. It's been a monster game the last couple of years. We had a couple years ago, Gunner won the state championship, and Pottsboro was the state runner-up in their respective 3A divisions. So this is always a big game. Gunner comes in at 1-0. They won 43-7 against Sunnyvale. Pottsboro is coming off a loss. They lost to Community 56-41, and that's Pottsboro's first loss in a season opener since 2009. So this rarely happens. And if they were to lose to Gunner, the 2009 is sort of the mark. for these sorts of negative sort of numbers, because that was a team that went 1-9. So everybody since then has had a winning record. Obviously won their opener. So if there are some struggles, it does date back to that 2009 squad, which followed a state semifinal appearance, and the Cardinals basically graduated literally everybody. They were all seniors, and so it was that was a true rebuilding year because everybody was gone. And so obviously the biggest question is going to be about this matchup, which I will point out, Pottsboro has won the last 2 years. They are the only team to beat Gunner in the regular season in 53 games. So that's how dominant Gunner has been, and the Pottsboro has been the thorn in their side these last 2 years. Last year was a 34-21 game, but a lot of those guys are gone. But if I'm looking at it from that perspective, especially on offense, Pottsboro put up 41 points last week. They had a quarterback change. They had they lost Titus Lyons at receiver. They essentially lose a running back because Jet Carroll, the running back, moves over to play quarterback. So that's a different. So you have all these guys at different positions. They still put up points. They still scored 41 points. They still had over. I think that's over 500 yards. It's pretty close to it. They had 286 yards rushing and 168 yards passing. The big thing for them, they did have some quarterback. They used two guys. They used Halen Flanagan and Jet Carroll, and they both had their moments. But they did also have 3 interceptions, and that was more. I'm going to say that was more or less the difference in the game. But Community, who also had 500 yards, they didn't have any turnovers, and Pottsboro had 3. And in a 2-possession game, that's big enough to sort of swing the tables against you when you lose the turnover battle 3-0. But Pottsboro, like I said, they did put up points. Major McBride led the running attack. He had 16 carries for 153 yards and 3 touchdowns. Carroll had a touchdown run. He had 14 carries for 82 yards with that TD run, and he also had a touchdown pass to Jake Kubik. Halen Flanagan added a touchdown run. So like I said, the offense worked. The defense, unfortunately, did not sort of hold up their end of the bargain. They gave up 56 points, and Community had 507 yards. 404 of that was on the ground. So if you're looking at them in terms of what Gunner's probably going to attack and what Pottsboro needs to focus on, it's the running game, which when you're facing Gunner, that may not exactly bode well based on the weapons that they have. And so we mentioned Gunner won their game 43-7, and they did it in typical Gunner fashion. They jumped up early. Sunnyvale, had one score after it was already 43-0. Late in the third quarter, they barely had 200 yards of offense, only 12 first downs, and Gunner put up over 600 yards of offense, 602 to be exact. They had 406 yards rushing and then another 196 yards passing. Hudson Graham led the way. He was 10 of 12 passing for 196 yards and 3 touchdowns. 2 of those were to Cole Lemons, who had 4 catches for 90 yards. Ivy Hellman had 2 catches for 58 yards, and the other score, Ethan Sloan had 9 carries for 70 yards and a touchdown. He also had 3 catches for 43 yards. Caden Rigsby added a touchdown on the ground. So it was a typical sort of Gunner game, and again, this was going to be an interesting game. A lot of people in the state were interested in seeing this matchup because Sunnyvale is traditionally normally a really good team. They're a 4A Division II program, so that's 2 rings up the ladder for Gunner to face a team like that. They're in the same level as Van Alstyne, but they were coming off a better season. So there were a lot of people that were interested to see how this game would turn out, and obviously it turned out to not be very close at all. And of course, you hate to say it's Pottsboro Gunner. And so who knows what's going to happen. I think you have a lot of gunner guys. Those seniors, they have a lot of guys who are 3-year starters, or guys who are young that have been, starting for 2 years. There's a lot of guys back from last year. This was a team that lost only 1 starter on offense and 2 starters on defense, and they're expected to do what they've done, the last 5 years. And one of the things they haven't done is beat Pottsboro, and I think there's nobody they want to beat more and win this game more than those guys. And it's at home, so there's gonna be a whole lot surrounding this one for sure. I know a lot of eyes are gonna be on that game, and I did that game last year. That was really fun because of the staggered schedule. I won't be able to be there this year, but I know it's going to be really fun for everybody for sure. The next game on the docket is another all-local matchup. Howe is going to be hosting Bells. This is a matchup of 0-1 teams after Howe lost to Callisburg 35-21, and Bells lost in overtime against Whitesboro 41-34. And that is probably the biggest takeaway score when we talk about Whitesboro here in a minute. That Bells got in a shootout with Whitesboro, was unable to get a win. They won that game. I won't say pretty handily last year, but it was a defensive struggle last year. We had a totally flipped with 75 points scored this time. The two teams combined last year didn't get into the 30s, let alone into the 40s like they did this time. And so this is going to be interesting to see how Bells bounces back. That was a home game for them, and they obviously have some big ideas about what they could potentially do. They have a lot of people back. So in that game, last week I said, you put up 34 points. You think you have a pretty good chance to win. They ran for 427 yards. Leading the way was Bo Baker. He had 18 carries for 209 yards and a touchdown. Grady Waldrop had 27 carries for 117 yards and 2 scores. And Brock Baker had 18 carries for 84 yards. He threw a touchdown pass on a halfback throw to Caden Pyle for 26 yards. That was the only completion that Bells had in the game. They ran the ball 73 times, so you would think that they sort of controlled the action, but Whitesboro, matched them, quarter for quarter, and then was able to. They scored first in the overtime, and then were able to hang on, and we'll talk about their side of it when we get there in a couple games. And then Howe is coming off a game that last year was very lopsided. So if I'm Howe, I'm looking at my performance against Callisburg as, hey, we were better. And I think some of the teams that we're going to talk about here as we get to the latter half of the list, the biggest thing, whether it's with new coaches or having your full complement of players back after dealing with injuries, since you're playing people from last year, did you show improvement? Was your game competitive? And this was a game last year. Callisburg came right out under a new head coach in Eddie Gill, and ran wild in that game and just ran over Howe. And this was a game that is tied at halftime. It's tied 14-14. Callisburg had a 1-point lead, 22-21 going to the fourth quarter, and that is obviously significant progress for the Bulldogs to be in that game. Austin Haley led them. He threw for 276 yards and a touchdown to Caleb McNutt, who had 5 catches for 100 yards and the score. Cooper Jones had 7 catches for 71 yards, but he did score 2 touchdowns. One came on a run, and one was a 70-yard kickoff return. And Ryan Huff had 5 catches for 61 yards. Howe did not run the ball well at all. They only had 37 yards on 25 carries. They had Haley throw 35 times in this game. And so I don't know how sustainable that is, especially against some of the people that they're going to face before they get into a really tough district. So that may be something to watch to see what they do in the ground game against Bells on Friday night. But like I said, a respectable showing, against a team that was a playoff team last year, that was 5-5, that had beat you. I think by almost, if it wasn't by 40, it was by almost 40 points last year. And then you go into the final quarter, down a point, because they went for a 2-point conversion and got it. So that's a good sign for how. And then, like I said, with Bells, the big thing is to see how they bounce back after a game that they had literally go to down to the final possession. They had a chance to extend that game and they weren't able to, and Whitesboro hung on there. So that's going to be Bells at Howe on Friday night. The next game, we'll get into Whitesboro. Whitesboro is going to be traveling to Aubrey. This is a matchup of 1-0 teams. And this was a game last year that Aubrey won 26-3. And I don't think I don't think that score for that 3 for Whitesboro is going to hold up this year. Doing the preview and looking at them from last year, they had to figure some things out on offense. They were trying to figure out who the quarterback was going to be. They found out about maybe midway point that Mac Harper was going to be the guy, and he settled in. They went on a run in district. They came up short on a tiebreaker, but it was obvious they had sort of figured some stuff out. And then you look at the start this year, they put up 41 points. They won in overtime. They got the ball first in overtime and went and scored. So that's a really good jumping off point for an offense that last year, it probably took them 3 or 4 games to get 41 points total. It was a real struggle, and obviously you can tell you had a lot of young kids, a lot of sophomores that were figuring things out, and maybe they figured it out faster than maybe everybody thought. Harper threw for 231 yards and 2 touchdowns in the win. Jake Hermes led the way in receiving. He had 3 catches for 109 yards and a long touchdown. Grayson Ledbetter had 18 carries for 133 yards and 4 touchdowns, including the game winner, or the game decider. I guess it wasn't technically a game winner because Bells had a chance to go and get, potentially win the game with a 2-point conversion. Really good balance. They had 223 yards rushing and 231 passing. And like I said, that's a real good jumping off point, and they're going to face another good opponent in Aubrey this week. Aubrey had a really good year last year. They're coming off a 55-7 win against Burke Burnett. This was a series that Whitesboro had sort of dominated, before last year. So it's going to be interesting to see if that was sort of a blip or if Aubrey is going to continue what they were able to do last year in a 4A district that they ended up winning despite being in there with Salina and some of those people. So again, this will be another good sort of measuring stick game to see how far Whitesboro has come. They got off to a really good start by winning that game on Friday against Bells, and we'll see what they can do with another road trip going to Aubrey. And again, this is a team that has Gunner coming up. Gunner is looming on their schedule, to say nothing of the people in their district. So we'll see if Whitesboro's got this firepower that can sort of match some people blow for blow. They did that against Bells, and we'll see what they can do against Aubrey on Friday night. The next game is SNS, and they will be hosting Callisburg. So we just talked about Callisburg, what they did against Howe. That was a nip and tuck game. They like to run the ball. They did go to the air a couple times, but for the most part, they hit one long touchdown pass, but for the most part, it was with their running game. And so this is going to be an interesting matchup because you have SNS is coming off a 64-28 loss against Paris Chisholm. They had to find a new opponent after they beat Tom Bean last year in the opener, 70-0. So obviously this is a complete 180 from that. They scored 70 last year and they almost gave up 70 this year. A lot of changes for SNS that we talked about going into the year. They had some quarterback change, some guys in some new spots. They were still able to put up some points. 28 points is. I mean, that's not. I feel like that's sort of average. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily say that's. That's a bad or a subpar sort of performance. So 28's a good. Like I said, that's a good starting point for a lot of the people that they had. That they had lost. And so it's going to be interesting to see sort of where they go in the second game. They had almost 400 yards of offense. Coda Richardson, threw for 207 yards and 3 touchdowns. Now that performance was an under 50% passer completion percentage. He's 15 of 33, and he did have an interception. But Colton Corville carried things. He had 4 catches for 101 yards and 2 touchdowns. Eli Mahan had the other touchdown. It was a 35-yard catch. And they ran for 170 yards too. Chase Sloan had 53 of that and a touchdown. So, it was a good, it was a decent showing. The first time out for the offense. Obviously, the defense. That was not a good start. You give up 64 points. Chisholm finishes with a lot of yardage on the ground. They only threw 7 passes, and they got 72 yards off of that. The majority of their yardage was on the ground, and when I say a majority, I say 539. So not the start that SNS wanted there. I mean, obviously it's a different opponent, and so like I said, if you were game planning against stuff from last year, you didn't have that here. And this was a game against Callisburg. The defense was really carrying SNS at times last year. They opened with the shutout against Tom Bean, then they shut out Callisburg the week after that. It was a 14-0 game last year. So this is going to be an interesting matchup. I think Callisburg maybe went into this game last year thinking, okay, after a big win against Howe, we're going to move to 2-0, and they got stymied. And we'll see what SNS has in store for Callisburg when they play on Friday night. The next game on the schedule is Whitewright traveling to Honey Grove, and this is a matchup of teams that were involved in shutouts last week. Whitewright won its game 49-0 against Clarksville, while Honey Grove lost its game 35-0 against Tenaha. Whitewright dominated against Clarksville defensively. I mean, you could say offensively too, but they didn't really pack yardage into that 49 points. So I don't know if you kind of would say they were just sort of running up and down the field. But defensively, obviously, they opened with a shutout. It was their first shutout since 2014, and they held Clarksville to 63 yards, 57 on the ground, and only 6 passing. And they didn't really do it with turnovers. There was only 1 turnover. Drives did not happen. And the one drive and the one turnover wasn't even on offense. It was on a kickoff return, recovering a fumble. So, but they were up 21-0 after the first quarter, 35-0 at halftime, and they were able to sort of cruise from there and hold on to get the shutout. Caden Caraway led the way. He had 8. He was 8 of 14 passing for 109 yards and 4 touchdowns, and had 11 carries for 116 yards. Zy Daniels had 5 catches for 62 yards and 3 touchdowns. Maverick Sartain had the other touchdown catch, and then Colby Jones had 11 carries for 59 yards and 2 scores as well. Clayton Warford added a touchdown run in the fourth quarter. And like I said, I mean, you look at 49-0, and then Whitewright only had a little over 350 yards. Now, they didn't even run 50 plays. They only ran 45 plays in this game. So that has a lot to do with it. And I'm sure they had short fields because of Clarksville literally not moving the ball at all based on the yardage numbers. So that's a really good start for Whitewright. And that was a game that they lost last year. It was a close game, but it was a loss. And so that's a huge flip for them. and now they're going up against a team that they did beat last year, and who's coming off a game where they just put up 91 total yards against Tenaha, which is a state-ranked team. So that there's that caveat, but I think things have set up very nicely for Whitewright after opening with that game, and then to see what they could potentially do at Honey Grove as they try to get a little momentum going. Like we mentioned last week, they missed the playoffs last year, essentially on a tiebreaker. They had a chance to play. If they had a chance to play their last game and win, they would have gone to the playoffs, but they had a COVID-19 situation where they were not allowed to play, so they had to forfeit, and Leonard went to the playoffs instead of having to play Whitewright, and the winner was going to go to the playoffs, and the loser stayed home. So I think Whitewright's out to show, hey, we know we're one of the 4 best teams, and they want to show some of that going into district play, and they started off in a good way for sure with that win over Clarksville on Friday night. Last couple of games here, we're down to the Final 4. Next game is Tioga at Electra. You have Tioga, who is 0-1. They lost 28-21 against Petrolia. And Electra is 1-0. They pulled out a defensive slugfest, 12-7 against Memphis. This was a game that Electra won last year, 49-18. And from Tioga's perspective, like we mentioned before, their opening game was a game that last year that did not go well at all. It was not close at all. And then you have a game this year that you turn that around, and you go from losing a game 38-0 to losing 28-21, and you have a chance to potentially tie that game in the fourth quarter with a couple of possessions. So that's improvement. They were able to move the ball pretty effectively on the ground. They had Chase Evans had 20 carries for 76 yards and a touchdown. Logan Westbrook had 17 carries and 67 yards at quarterback. He also threw for 119 yards. And then Johnny Dorpinghouse had 18 carries for 51 yards, and he had all 119 yards receiving on 3 catches and a touchdown. So definite immediate improvement there. The question is going to be, can you continue that going here into week 2? Now, this is a game, again, last year, Tioga lost this game 49-18. So that's you have a 31-point difference. And it was against a team, Electra last year only won 2 games. And they obviously did not look real great against Memphis in their first game. So this could be a chance that if you've got that improvement, and maybe Electra has taken even a step back from a team that only won 2 games, maybe you win this game. Maybe at the very least you have some positive building blocks to build on, because the scores you're more competitive. And I think obviously Tioga showed that in game 1. They went on the road to Petrolia. They're going on the road against Electra this week. So I'm interested to see what that score is, and see if Coach Rogers can get that first win for him over at Tioga when they go on the road on Friday. Next game up is Collinsville going to Cooper. We have all the 2As are going on the road this week. Collinsville is 0-1. They lost 29-21 against Blue Ridge, and Cooper is 1-0. They were able to pull out a 25-23 win against Grand Saline. Collinsville won this game last year 40-33. And so I am interested to see, again, with the scores on this one. Looking at the game against against Blue Ridge, Collinsville, the issue for them in falling behind and coming up short was their pass defense. They gave up 268 yards to Casey Walls, who was 16 of 23, and his main target, as it has been there at Blue Ridge, is Jonathan Garza. He had 9 catches for 216 yards and 3 touchdowns, and one of them was for 78 yards, one was for 34 yards, one was for 11 yards. So obviously I mean Cooper is a running team, based on what they normally, they've got Gunner coaches there in charge and sort of the way they want to run things. So they're built on that the basic offensive principles that Gunner has used in the past in their recent success. So I don't anticipate a lot of passing, but maybe you see what Blue Ridge was able to do and you take advantage of that. Collinsville did. They got back in this game late. The only offense that they had in the first three quarters was Garrett Trevino recovering a fumble in the end zone. He blitzed right up the middle, was able to disrupt the exchange in the ends, at the goal, essentially at the goal line, and was able to fall on the ball and get the scoring there. And then it took till the fourth quarter for them to kind of mount the comeback. Lance Stone had a touchdown run. He took over at quarterback for the first time this year. He had 21 carries for 85 yards. And then they had a little. I don't know if you necessarily call it a rotation, but they played two quarterbacks. Logan Jenkins got in there as well. He had a 36-yard touchdown pass to Carter Scott, who had 4 catches for 51 yards. The big thing there, obviously, if you want to talk, we talked about close games and how turnover margin can get you beat. Even though Blue Ridge had 3 fumbles, Collinsville had one more turnover. They had 4 interceptions. Each guy threw 2 touchdowns or threw 2 interceptions. And like I said, you have 2 guys that are playing quarterback for the first time. And I think that's obviously the big thing there. And then, like I said, the biggest thing with them is probably going to be able to figure it out. It seems like Collinsville always plays close games. I looked it up. That's one of the notes. So they've lost 7 games. Their last 7 losses, 5 of them have been decided by 8 points or less, a single possession. And most of their wins are too. Like we mentioned, Collinsville's win against Cooper last year was by 7 points. The win against Blue Ridge last year came down to the final seconds, and they were able to score and pull that game out. So I don't know what it is about Collinsville, but all their games are close, which makes it very hard to tell, on a weekly basis where they kind of stand. So this will be an interesting one for sure. Going on the road to Cooper, who, like we said, they pulled out a win, and I'm looking at it right now. They didn't even have any passing yards last week against Grand Saline. So maybe that's a good sign for Collinsville, that they're not going to be able to do that as Blue Ridge did against them this week. And the last 2A game of the week, Tom Bean goes to Prairieland. Tommy's coming off a 26-22 loss against Morton, with a long drive out to Seymour in a neutral site game that came down to the fourth quarter. And Prairieland is 1-0. They won 28-7 against Alba Golden. And again, I think this is another case of a team that struggled last year. Had made the playoffs 2 years in a row, took a step back, has a new head coach. Much like Tioga, you're playing a different opponent. You have a really long drive on a Saturday, so you're not even playing on a Friday night. All things speaking, they had a 22-20 lead. I guess middle of the fourth quarter is probably the best way to describe that. And then Morton scored to jump ahead, and Tommy wasn't able to come up with an answer. But outside of that, you had obviously I feel like Morton's probably a step down from playing in S&S. But the fact that game was close gives some guys some confidence. They have a ton of new starters both sides of the ball because they had a relatively big senior class with a lot of two-way guys for a two-way program. And so they started to figure it out as the game went on. Branson Ashlock got the nod at quarterback. He's a sophomore. He ran 17 times for 131 yards and threw for 102 yards, had a touchdown pass to MJ Irvin, who also returned a kickoff for a score, and then Dustin Hickman added the other touchdown on the ground. Alex Sanchez had 5 catches for 42 yards and 4 rushes for 25 yards to round things out for Tom Bean. And so going into this game against Prairieland, a game that Tom Bean lost last year 56-19. Again, I think it's sort of that measuring stick game. Are you getting better? Are you better than you were last year? If you can't win this game, can you at least make it more competitive? The one thing that Coach Whitmire talked about a lot was if they were going to make a step forward, have a winning record, return to the playoffs after missing last year, the defense had to be better. They gave up a ton of points last year, and a ton, basically high 40s, 50s, 60s every week. And Prairie Land was an example of that last year, as well as the SNS game last year. They gave up 70. So it's a different opponent, but you held somebody to 4 touchdowns, 26 points. Let's see what you can do now against Prairie Land as you try to see where you're at in week 2. So that's going to be interesting for Tom Bean going into this game and see kind of where they're at after dealing with a long road trip on a Saturday, so they had less time to recover for this one as well. So that should be interesting also as an aspect to this game. And then the last game in the 6-man ranks, we have Texoma Christian hosting Ovia Christian. Both teams are 0-1. Texoma Christian lost last week 50-18 against Highlands, and Ovia Christian lost 54-30 against Fort Worth Thesa. So somebody's going to get their first win coming out of this one. Touching on TCS's outing last week, Hayden Turner led the team. He had 10 carries for 107 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also threw for 80 yards and a touchdown to Jackson Perkey. And then you throw in some other stuff for their guys. Christian Garcia led the team in receiving. He had 3 catches for 32 yards and 6 rushes for 38 yards. And so it'll be interesting to see what the Eagles look like. We talked about in the preseason lead up. They only played 6 regular season games last year because of COVID and everything, and a shortened schedule and that sort of thing. And they still were able to make the playoffs. But it was very up and down for them. And this was a game. It's 8-6 after the first quarter, and then Highlands was able to sort of to pull away. And a lot of what they did was more of a balanced attack. It wasn't anything dominating on one side of the ground or the other. So now you have a team in TCS trying to find themselves a little bit. And it's going to be interesting to see what they can do against an Ovia Christian team that gave up 300 yards rushing last week. So that was the way to attack them. It will be interesting to see how TCS handles that. When you look at the guys last week and what they were able to do, the averages for yardages are pretty good. All the guys who got significant carries, so that's a good sign for TCS, that if they have to run the ball, they were able to do that pretty effectively last week. So it might be a situation where they can do that as well this week. So that's a look at all the games for week 2. We'll see how things shake out. Obviously, we have some big games, and this is not necessarily a swing week, but it is one of those weeks where we have a lot of people that can get to 2-0. We have a lot of people that can try to avoid getting to 0-2, turn some things around based off of what the first game is. And I know a lot of people want to overreact to the first game of the season. It's all we have to go on. But like I said, there were teams that lost that game last year, still made the playoffs and had good seasons. And there are some teams that win the first game and then struggle to get anything going the rest of the way. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully everybody stays healthy. We get all the games in again this week, and enjoy whatever game you're going to go to. Try to stay cool. I think hopefully this will be the last week that we only have to deal with extreme heat as we get officially into September. Hopefully we can start to cool off with the Week 3 games. But we'll deal with Week 2 as we deal with it, and we'll talk to you next week. Thanks a lot.